It was the kind of summer that should have been unforgettable for all the right reasons. The kind of summer where the sun clung to your skin, where laughter echoed through pine trees, and childhood memories were carved into wooden cabins and lakeside docks. But for the Carter family, the summer of 1987 became a wound that never fully closed. When Lily and June, just 8 years old, vanished without a trace from their cabin at Camp Whispering Pines, the world they knew cracked open into a haunting silence. No signs, no suspects, just two identical beds left untouched, and a chilling void that swallowed everything whole. Over the decades, the case faded like old photographs, grainy, yellowed, and quietly forgotten by everyone except those who loved the girls. The authorities had theories, of course. Runaways, abduction, even tragic accidents swallowed by the wilderness. But nothing stuck, and as time marched forward, their names turned into whispered prayers during holidays, into candles lit on birthdays, into the unanswered ache that hardened in their parents' eyes. Until one day, 30 years later, when a dusty attic, a forgotten painting, and a trembling hand brought a sudden heartbeat back to a mystery that had long been declared dead. Uncle Michael never stopped looking. Even as the world insisted it was time to move on, he returned to the camp every summer, walking the overgrown trails, speaking their names like they could hear him. It was in the old family home, while helping clear out his late brother's belongings, that he found it, a portrait of the girls hanging silently above the fireplace. But it wasn't the image that stunned him. It was what was hidden behind it. Folded with care, yellowed by time, and written in the handwriting he hadn't seen since the girl's last birthday, was a note. 6 lines, fewer than 40 words. But each one would unravel everything they thought they knew. There was no mistaking it. The note wasn't just a cry for help. It was a clue, a breadcrumb left with the hope that someone, someday, would follow it. And suddenly, the questions that had once suffocated the family came rushing back with terrifying clarity. Who wrote the note? And why had it been hidden in plain sight for so long? What secret had been buried so deep that only now was it beginning to surface? And, most chillingly of all, what if Lily and June had never left the camp at all? What followed in the days after that discovery was a descent into a web of lies, betrayal, and hidden truths that had been festering beneath the surface for decades. A puzzle more intricate than anyone could have imagined, where every answer brought new questions, and where one man's relentless search for the truth might finally bring justice or uncover something far darker than anyone was prepared to face. The note was simple, too simple. Written in uneven, childlike letters, it read, "We didn't mean to go. He said we'd come back. Don't trust the man in the blue cap." Uncle Michael's breath caught as he read it again and again, each time hearing their voices echo in his mind. The handwriting matched Lily's, he was sure of it. But it wasn't just the message that unsettled him. It was the fact that it had been deliberately hidden behind the painting, sealed there with tape that had turned brittle with age. Someone didn't just want it preserved. They wanted it protected, hidden from the wrong eyes. He placed the note carefully on the table and stared at it, his hands trembling. The words pulsed with implication. Don't trust the man in the blue cap. Who was he? Why would they fear him? Michael's mind spiraled back to every camp counselor, every handyman, every local who had ever been on the grounds that summer. And then he remembered. There was a man, a quiet one, lanky, always in the background, with a faded Navy baseball cap and a gaze that never quite met your own. The man had vanished from town just weeks after the twins disappeared. Michael knew he couldn't keep this to himself. But after 3 decades of dead ends and disbelief, going to the authorities again felt like screaming into the void. No, this time, he would start his own search. He dug through old camp rosters, photo albums, and visitor logs. Days bled into nights as he retraced steps long since abandoned. Every document, every scrap of memory, was a potential map to the truth. The past wasn't just calling, it was clawing its way back. One photo stopped him cold. A group picture of the camp staff from that year, yellowed and creased, but clear enough to recognize the faces. And there he was, the man in the blue cap. The back of the photo had names scribbled in pencil, almost faded away. Michael ran his finger across them. Jeffrey Lowell. That was it. A name, a direction, a spark in the darkness. But what had happened to Jeffrey? And what had he done to Lily and June? That night, Michael couldn't sleep. The faces from the photo haunted him, their smiles hollow with hindsight. He wondered how many of them had known something, or suspected. How many had looked away, choosing comfort over confrontation. The silence of 30 years felt louder than ever. But now, for the first time in decades, he had a lead. And even if it took him to the darkest places, Michael was ready to follow it. Because this time, someone had finally left the door open. The next morning, Michael made calls, dozens of them. Former camp staff, local authorities, old friends from town. Some numbers were disconnected, some went straight to voicemail, but a few picked up. The conversations were cautious, strained. Most didn't remember Jeffrey. A few did, and their recollections were vague. Quiet guy, they said. Kept to himself. But one name kept coming up, Diane Harris. She had been a camp nurse in 1987, and according to several sources, she had spent more time around Jeffrey than anyone else. Finding Diane was easier than expected. She was still living in the state, retired now, just 2 hours away. Michael drove in silence, the note in his jacket pocket like a ghost he couldn't shake. As he pulled into her driveway, he wasn't sure what he hoped to find. Answers? Closure? Or just someone who could confirm that he wasn't chasing shadows. Diane opened the door slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took him in. And when he introduced himself, her expression changed. Not surprise, not confusion, but something closer to regret. They sat at her kitchen table, the smell of chamomile tea drifting between them. Michael laid the note on the table without a word. Diane didn't touch it. Her hands remained curled around her mug, knuckles white. After a long pause, she spoke, softly, as if every word were made of glass. "I always feared this would come back," she said, "but I didn't expect it from you." Her voice trembled with something deeper than fear. Guilt. Diane told him about the summer of 1987. How strange Jeffrey had been, always volunteering for night watch, always hanging around the children's cabins after lights out. She had brought her concerns to the camp director, twice. Both times, she was told to let it go. "He's harmless," they said. "Don't make trouble." But Diane had seen things. Bruises on Lily's wrist, June's sudden change in behavior. And then one night, they were gone. And Jeffrey had already left before sunrise. "I thought about going to the police," Diane admitted, her voice breaking. "But I was young. Afraid." They made it clear the camp's reputation mattered more than the truth. And I've lived with that cowardice ever since. Michael's hands curled into fists. The truth had been buried, not by time, but by choice. Diane's silence, the camp's denial, the town's forgetfulness, all of it had protected a predator. And the twins had paid the price. Diane handed him a worn envelope from a drawer. Inside was a copy of complaints she had written, never sent. At the bottom, Jeffrey's full name and an address she had once seen scribbled on a clipboard. It was probably outdated, but it was something. And Michael, filled with a mixture of rage and resolve, knew exactly what he had to do next. Find the man in the blue cap, and finally, get the answers that had eluded them for 30 years. The address Diane gave him led to a remote part of the state, a forgotten pocket of farmland where the roads were narrow and the houses sat far apart like strangers. Michael followed the directions in silence, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. With every mile, his mind replayed the note, Diane's trembling voice, and that photo, Jeffrey's distant stare and the faded cap shading his eyes. He didn't know what he would find at the end of the road, but every instinct told him he was getting closer to something buried, something that didn't want to be found. The house was small, sagging with age, and surrounded by wild grass and rusted fences. A dog barked in the distance, but otherwise, the place felt lifeless. Michael parked and approached cautiously, each step echoing like a warning. When he knocked on the door, it took a full minute before someone answered. The man who opened it was older now, gray in the beard, bent in the shoulders, but Michael recognized him instantly. The same sunken eyes, the same wary stare. Jeffrey Lowell. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jeffrey squinted and said, "You're Carter's brother." Michael nodded, his voice caught in his throat. Jeffrey didn't ask how he'd been found. He didn't invite him in. He simply stepped aside, as if he'd known this day would come. Inside, the air was thick with dust and time. Old newspapers were stacked in corners. A single photo of the camp hung crooked on the wall. And there, on the mantel, was the same navy cap, still intact, still waiting. Michael sat down and placed a note on the table without a word. Jeffrey's eyes scanned it, then looked away. "They told me never to come back," he muttered. "Said it would be better if I disappeared." His voice was hoarse, but not defensive, not even surprised. He poured himself a drink, his hand shaking. "I didn't take them," he said finally, "but I know who did." The room froze. For 30 years, Michael had imagined confrontation, confession, maybe even violence. But not this, not a deflection. Jeffrey leaned back, his gaze distant. There was another man at the camp. Not staff, not a counselor. Someone who came and went. He had money, influence. Everyone knew, but no one spoke his name. Michael's heart pounded. A new layer, a deeper lie. Jeffrey pulled out an old camp newsletter and circled a name. He sponsored the camp that year, paid for repairs, said it was for the community. Michael read the name and felt the world tilt. It was someone he knew, someone respected, someone who'd stood at the twins' funeral with tears in his eyes. And now, 30 years later, his mask was beginning to slip. The name Jeffrey gave him belonged to Charles Hensley, a local businessman, philanthropist, and one of the wealthiest men in the county back in the late 1980s. He had funded schools, churches, and yes, Camp Whispering Pines. Michael remembered him well. His broad smile, his polished shoes, the way everyone leaned in when he spoke. Back then, he was untouchable. And if what Jeffrey said was true, he had used that untouchability to hide something unthinkable. Michael drove straight to the local library, searching through archives, newspaper clippings, donation records, anything that could place Hensley at the camp during the summer of 1987. The evidence piled quickly. Photographs from ribbon-cutting ceremonies, articles praising his generosity, even testimonials from camp counselors thanking him personally. But then something else surfaced. A sealed court record from 1991 involving a domestic dispute and allegations dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The name of the plaintiff was redacted, but the pattern was forming, and it stank of silence. Fueled by fury, Michael contacted one of the former camp directors, an old man now in a nursing home. At first, the man denied everything. But when Michael mentioned Hensley's name, his voice dropped. "We couldn't fight him," he whispered. "He owned the land. He owned the police. He said they were lying. Said little girls make things up." Michael's stomach turned. These weren't just failures. They were betrayals of trust, of innocence, of justice. And every adult who looked the other way was complicit. Determined to press further, Michael began contacting other former campers. Some had moved across the country, some didn't want to talk, but one woman agreed. Emily Sayers. She'd been 13 that summer, and what she remembered would change everything. "I saw them," she said over the phone, her voice brittle with age and fear. That night, the twins, they weren't alone. They were with a man, not Jeffrey, someone older, someone they were scared of. She had told a counselor. She had begged them to listen. And the next day, she was sent home early for behavioral issues. Michael sat in his car, the phone still in his hand, heart racing with grief and rage. The truth wasn't just buried. It had been deliberately crushed beneath a mountain of power, fear, and lies. But now, the cracks were showing. And somewhere in those cracks, Lily and June were waiting. For their story to be heard. For their names to be reclaimed. For someone, anyone, to finally stop being afraid. Michael knew he couldn't move forward without confronting Charles Hensley directly. But this wasn't a man who would welcome questions. Not after decades of evading them. Michael needed to be prepared. He began collecting everything. The note, the photo, Diane's statement, the call with Emily. He compiled it into a file thick with pain and truth, and yet fragile, because none of it was enough on its own. He needed something irrefutable, and that meant going back to the camp, to the place where it all began. Camp Whispering Pines had been shut down years ago, after a fire destroyed part of the main lodge. Rumors swirled, vandalism, insurance fraud, a final attempt to erase the past. But Michael didn't believe in coincidences anymore. He made the trip alone, arriving just before dusk. The air was heavy with memories, and the forest stood silent, as if holding its breath. The cabins were skeletal, their windows shattered, walls blanketed in ivy. Still, the place whispered, and Michael listened. He retraced the twins' last known steps, from the dining hall to their cabin. The floorboards creaked under his feet. Their bunk beds were gone, but the walls still bore scratches and names etched by forgotten hands. Then, behind a loose panel near the baseboard, Michael found something. A small, rusted tin box. Inside were 2 friendship bracelets, a broken locket, and a piece of paper with a crude map drawn in red crayon. The map pointed to the woods, and next to it, written in shaky letters, were the words, "Where the owls cry." The phrase pierced him. It had been a nickname the girls used for a clearing in the woods, a quiet spot where owls nested in the tall pines. Michael had almost forgotten about it, but now it felt like a scream from the past, a desperate attempt to lead anyone back to them. He took the map and followed its path through the dense trees, heart pounding with every step. The forest thickened, shadows lengthened, and then he saw it. A stone well, half collapsed, covered in moss. Silent, ancient, waiting. He stepped closer. Something was off. A chain hung from the side, attached to a rusted pulley. The rope snapped long ago. Michael knelt, shining his flashlight down the opening. What he saw stopped his breath. Bones. Small. Human. Entangled with the fabric of a faded yellow dress. He staggered back, the earth spinning beneath him. It wasn't just evidence. It was confirmation. The twins had never left the camp, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one ever found them. Michael called the authorities immediately, his voice steady despite the storm within him. This time, they couldn't ignore him. The remains were retrieved, and the bracelets, along with the locket, were taken as part of the investigation. DNA testing would take time, but in his heart, Michael already knew. The dress matched the one June had worn in their last photo. The forest had been their grave for over 3 decades, and now, finally, it was speaking. News spread quickly. Headlines screamed the rediscovery. Old wounds reopened in the community, and reporters descended like vultures. But amid the chaos, Michael remained focused. He wasn't done. Not while Hensley remained free. Armed with everything he had, he arranged a private meeting through one of Hensley's former business contacts, claiming he wanted to discuss legacy preservation. A lie, but an effective one. The meeting was granted. They met in a glass tower downtown, Hensley's empire glimmering behind polished windows. He was older now, 75, perhaps, but his posture still spoke of control. Michael watched him closely, looking for cracks. At first, the conversation was formal, cordial. Then Michael placed a note on the table. The air changed. Hensley's eyes didn't flicker, but his jaw tightened. When Michael laid down the bracelet and locket, the silence became suffocating. "I know what you did," Michael said softly, "and I know you paid to make it disappear." Hensley leaned back, fingers interlocked. "Do you have proof?" he asked, almost amused. Michael slid a recorder across the table. "Not yet, but soon. And when I do, it won't be a whisper. It'll be a storm." For the first time, Hensley looked uncertain. Not afraid, but aware that the past he buried was crawling back. And this time, it had a voice. Michael left the building without looking back. The storm had begun, and though the road ahead was steep and the cost of truth high, he would walk it. For Lily. For June. For every child whose voice had been silenced by fear and power. The man in the blue cap had only been the surface. Now the rot beneath was being exposed, and the reckoning had only just begun. The remains found at the well were soon confirmed. They belonged to Lily Carter. The DNA results came back with 100% certainty, and the bracelet, woven from red and white thread, was unmistakably hers. Michael sat in his car when he got the call, staring out at the rain-streaked windshield, the world around him blurred into a silent grief. One twin found, one still missing, and with that confirmation, the investigation reopened. Not quietly this time, but with force. Detectives who had once shelved the case as cold now combed through the original files with renewed eyes. Michael provided every statement, every detail, every name he had gathered. Diane was questioned. Emily, too. Even Jeffrey was brought in for a deposition. Yet Hensley remained distant, surrounded by a fortress of lawyers and influence. He hadn't been arrested. Not yet. But the net was tightening, and he knew it. Michael could see it in the news clips, in the slight tremor in Hensley's once commanding voice during interviews. The predator was beginning to feel watched. Then came the break Michael didn't expect. Not from the police, but from a janitor who had worked at the camp in the late 80s. He contacted Michael anonymously, asking for a meeting. His name was Walt, and he looked haunted by years of silence. They met at a gas station on the edge of town. Walt's voice was barely above a whisper as he recounted the night the girls disappeared. "I saw them," he said. "I saw Hensley taking them to his car." Walt had been told to keep quiet, for the good of the camp, for your job, for your future. He did. He kept his mouth shut, and the guilt festered like a wound. But now, watching the news, hearing Michael speak out, something inside him cracked. "It's time," he said. "Time to tell the truth." He handed Michael a worn photograph, one he had taken secretly the day after the disappearance. It showed Hensley's car, parked behind the camp storage unit. The trunk was open, and in the background, a glimpse of yellow fabric. Michael took the photo, his hands trembling. This wasn't just circumstantial. It was evidence, physical, dated, undeniable. And now, with Walt's statement, the foundation beneath Hensley's power began to erode. The silence that had protected him for decades was breaking apart, and with it came a surge of buried voices ready to be heard. The photo and testimony from Walt were delivered directly to the detectives leading the reopened case. The shift was immediate. Search warrants were issued. Hensley's properties were combed through with forensic teams. Documents were seized. Bank records, old camp files, visitor logs, all examined for patterns, movements, bribes. What had once been whispers now filled courtrooms. The man once seen as a benefactor was now under a cloud of suspicion too heavy to ignore. Michael watched from the sidelines, exhausted but resolute. Every step forward was a wound reopened. Memories of Lily's laugh, of June's shy smile, of their mother holding out hope long after the world had moved on. But now, for the first time, truth had momentum, and it was closing in. He knew it when the news broke that Hensley had voluntarily stepped away from several boards and charity positions. He knew it when his lawyers began requesting meetings instead of denying allegations outright. Still, the biggest question remained. Where was June? Her body hadn't been found. There had been no trace beyond the map and the bracelet. Could she have survived? Michael couldn't stop thinking about that possibility. The note, "We didn't mean to go." He said we'd come back. Could it mean she had been taken somewhere else? That only Lily had been left behind? It was a hope he was afraid to entertain, but also one he couldn't ignore. He returned to the well site, this time with a private forensic team. They searched the surrounding area meticulously, and they found something. Not remains, but a small, rusted pendant with the letter J engraved on it. It was identical to Lily's locket. Michael remembered it. The twins had matching ones. This one had been buried under a layer of moss near the tree line. As if dropped. As if June had run. The idea hit him like lightning. What if June had escaped? What if she had been alive, for a time, after that night? And if so, where had she gone? Who had seen her? Who had helped her? Or silenced her? The discovery reignited the investigation, and it gave Michael something he hadn't dared hold on to in 30 years, a glimmer of hope. The possibility that June might have survived shattered every assumption Michael had lived with for 3 decades. The image of her running through the woods, terrified and alone, refused to leave his mind. If the pendant had been dropped in haste, perhaps she had tried to leave a trail. Perhaps there were more clues scattered, overlooked by everyone in the panic and corruption of the original investigation. Michael returned to the clearing where the pendant was found and began to comb through every inch of ground, every tree trunk, every stone, searching for anything that might have been left behind. It wasn't long before he noticed something strange, a small carving on the bark of an old oak tree near the edge of the woods. It had faded with time, but was still faintly visible. 2 stick figures holding hands, beneath a crescent moon. It was a drawing style Michael recognized instantly. The girls used to draw like that in their journals, always adding a moon when they felt scared or lonely. It wasn't just a carving. It was a message. June had been there. She had tried to leave a sign, and that sign had gone unnoticed for decades. Michael's heart raced. He contacted Emily Sayers again, the former camper who had remembered seeing the girls that night. When he showed her the carving, her eyes welled with tears. "That was their secret code," she whispered. "They used to draw it on the back of notes they passed to me. It meant they were together, and they were scared. For Michael, it was confirmation. June had survived the initial abduction, but the forest was vast. She couldn't have stayed there long. Someone must have found her. Or worse, someone must have taken her again. With new direction, Michael turned to old missing persons reports, narrowing the search to the weeks following the girl's disappearance. And buried deep in the files, he found it. A Jane Doe, discovered by hikers near a highway 30 miles from the camp. Barefoot, dehydrated, traumatized, and unable to speak. She was around 8 years old, matching June's age. The report said she was taken to a state facility. And then she vanished again. Transferred, the document claimed. But to where? And why had no one followed up? Michael's blood ran cold. Someone had buried that trail. Again, someone had ensured that the girl's identity would remain unknown. He contacted the facility listed in the report, only to find it had been closed for over 20 years. Records were incomplete, fragmented. But one name stood out in the transfer documents: Dr. Evelyn Moray, a psychiatrist who had once worked closely with trauma victims in children's institutions. She was the key, and Michael knew it was time to find her and ask what really happened to the girl no one ever claimed. Dr. Evelyn Moray lived in a quiet coastal town now, retired and well into her 70s. Michael reached her after days of digging through outdated directories and following leads from former colleagues. At first, she was hesitant, guarded. But when he mentioned the Jane Doe from 1987, a girl found in the woods, silent, and possibly linked to Camp Whispering Pines, her voice shifted. "I remember her," she said. She had eyes like glass, distant, broken. She never spoke, but she drew. Constantly. They arranged to meet in person. Dr. Moray welcomed him into a sunlit home filled with books, old photographs, and framed children's artwork. "I kept some of her drawings," she said, leading him to a storage box. "I don't know why. I suppose. I hope someone would come one day." Michael's hands trembled as he sifted through the pages. Crayon sketches of forests, moons, owls, 2 girls holding hands. It was her. It had to be. June had survived, at least for a time, and she had tried to communicate the only way she knew how. But then, the story darkened. According to Dr. Moray, after several weeks of observation, the girl was transferred to a private institution under a court order. But no records of the judge or case number existed in the files. "I fought it," Dr. Moray said, her voice heavy. "But they told me she was being moved for her own safety. There had been threats. I suspected there was more to it. I believe she was taken, not for care, but for silence." Michael's mind spun. Who had the power to arrange such a transfer, with no trace, no accountability? Hensley. It had to be him, or someone like him. Part of the same circle, the same web of silence. Michael asked Dr. Moray if she remembered anything else, a name, a location. She shook her head, but then paused. "There was one visitor," she said slowly, "a man who claimed to be a distant relative. Well-dressed, polished, but he never showed any emotion. I never saw him again." Michael knew he was closer than ever, but the trail had shifted from a physical search to a war against shadows and sealed files. The system had failed June over and over. But now, the system was crumbling. And somewhere, buried in institutional archives or behind a forgotten identity, was the truth. June Carter had survived, and someone had stolen her voice again. But not this time. Not anymore. Determined not to let the trail go cold again, Michael reached out to a private investigator named Laura Mendel, renowned for handling cases abandoned by the justice system. She had spent over 2 decades uncovering the truths others buried: corrupt orphanages, undocumented transfers, families separated under false pretenses. When Michael laid out his evidence, Laura didn't hesitate. "This wasn't neglect," she said. "It was orchestration. Someone wanted this girl erased." Their first move was to identify the private institution that had taken in the Jane Doe. Though official state files were sanitized, Laura found an internal memo from a social worker dated 2 days after the transfer. It mentioned a facility called St. Aurelia's Home, a place that had operated for only 5 years before being quietly shut down. Funded by private donors, its records were supposedly lost in a fire. But Laura knew better. Fires like that often started with matches dipped in fear. They traveled to the remnants of St. Aurelia's together. Located on the edge of a forgotten county line, The building stood like a scar on the land, abandoned, windows broken, roof sagging. But inside, buried beneath rotting floorboards and crumbling walls, they found a small storage room with metal filing cabinets rusted shut. It took hours to pry them open. Most of the documents had deteriorated beyond recognition, but tucked between two mold-eaten folders was a thin file marked JC, transfer incomplete. Michael's hands trembled as he opened it. There was no full name, only initials. But a photo remained, paper-clipped to the top. A young girl with hollow eyes and dark hair, expression blank. Yet behind that emptiness, Michael saw it. A fragment of Lily's smile, of his brother's chin. It was June. It had to be. The page beneath listed dates, incident reports, even therapy summaries. One entry stood out. Subject responds to drawings of forest. Refuses to speak. Writes only the word owl. Every piece of his soul screamed confirmation. The pendant, the carvings, the note, they all pointed here. But the last page left Michael reeling. It stated that JC was removed from the facility before its closure. No record of where she was taken. No signature. Just one scribbled line in red ink. Request fulfilled. Patient released to custody of guardian. File closed. That phrase, file closed, echoed in Michael's mind like a cruel joke. Someone had taken June again, this time with legal backing. But who had signed off as her guardian? The name was missing. Redacted. Or never recorded at all. Laura was furious. This wasn't a rescue, she said, voice tight. It was a handoff. Someone paid for this child to vanish. The web had grown larger, darker, and somewhere inside it, June's identity had been rewritten. They focused next on tracing St. Aurelia's funding. Laura uncovered a list of silent donors from the late 1980s. Several were shell corporations, impossible to trace. But one name stood out among the buried identities, a foundation called the Owls Light Trust. The irony hit Michael hard. Owls again. Always owls. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a symbol, one the girls had used to signal fear, and one now embedded in the very organization that had taken June. The Owls Light Trust had dissolved in the early 90s, but through Laura's contacts, they uncovered tax records linking it to a now-defunct medical firm, owned by Charles Hensley. The circle was complete. He had funded the facility. He had orchestrated the second disappearance. And yet, still, he walked free, untouchable behind decades of misdirection. But now Michael had enough to expose him. Enough to bring the house of cards down. He prepared a full report. Photographs, testimonies, financial trails, and the St. Aurelia files. With Laura's help, they reached out to a journalist with a reputation for dismantling the powerful, Grace Delaney. She had brought down politicians, CEOs, even church officials. When she saw the case, her expression hardened. I'll run it. Front page. But you need to understand, once this story breaks, there's no going back. Michael didn't hesitate. Good, he said. Because I've spent 30 years trapped in the past. It's time the world joins me. The story was set to go live in 48 hours. And with it, the hope that somewhere, maybe in another name, another life, June Carter would finally be found. Or, at the very least, the walls around her prison would begin to fall. When the article dropped, it hit the nation like a thunderclap. The girl who disappeared twice. A twin's long road through silence was the headline, bold across the front page of one of the largest newspapers in the country. Grace Delaney didn't hold back. The piece detailed every step of the 30-year cover-up. The note, the map, the well, the transfer, the photos, the financial ties to Hensley. Accompanied by haunting images of the twins, it pierced hearts and ignited outrage. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Hashtag Justice for June. Hashtag Camp Whispering Truth. Hashtag Who Took the Twins. The public wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Hensley's office issued a vague denial, calling the story a malicious attack fueled by decades-old fiction. But the court of public opinion wasn't buying it. Protesters gathered outside his estate. TV trucks lined his street. And finally, under immense pressure, the district attorney reopened the criminal investigation, this time with full public oversight. Michael watched it unfold from his living room, exhausted, stunned. For 30 years, he had screamed into the void. Now, the void was screaming back. But even amid the noise, his mind was on one person, June. Was she out there? Had she seen the news? Had someone who knew her, maybe under a new name, in a foster home or private care, finally recognized the girl in the old photo? Leads began pouring in. Some were dead ends. Others carried a flicker of truth. One such lead came from a woman named Claire, a nurse in upstate New York, who had cared for a nonverbal patient in her early 20s during the early 2000s. She had the same eyes, Claire told Michael over the phone. Drawings of owls. Trees. Two little girls under the moon. We never understood what it meant. The woman, Claire explained, had been in and out of psychiatric care since she was a child. Her file listed her as Julia Clements. But Claire had always believed her story didn't add up. With renewed hope, Michael and Laura flew out the next day. The facility was private, nestled among snow-covered pines. The administrator was cautious, citing confidentiality, but after reviewing Michael's documents and the national attention the case had drawn, she agreed to let them meet Julia, under supervision. When Michael entered the room, the woman was sitting by a window, sketching in soft charcoal. She turned slowly, her eyes catching his, and time stopped. The silence between them stretched impossibly wide. Michael couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe, because those eyes, wide, guarded, deep as the woods they once fled through, were hers. She was older now, of course. Her hair darker, her face thinner, but the shape of her jaw, the curl of her lips, even the tilt of her head. It was June. He knew it before a single word passed between them. And yet, she said nothing. Her hand trembled slightly as she clutched the drawing pad tighter to her chest. He sat across from her, slowly, afraid to scare her off. "June," he whispered. "It's me. Michael. Your uncle." She didn't react at first, just stared at him, studying every line in his face, like searching for something lost. Then, she flipped to the drawing she'd been working on. A forest, a well, and two girls, hand in hand beneath a crescent moon. Tears spilled down Michael's cheeks. The same symbol she had etched onto the tree. The same one from the map. The same one that had haunted his dreams. A therapist gently approached her. "Julia, it's okay. You're safe." Slowly, she turned the page. Another drawing, this time a face. Lily, younger, smiling. She never stopped drawing her, the therapist said. She calls her the mirror. We always thought it was symbolic, but now, her voice faded. Michael reached out, laying a photo of Lily on the table. Julia looked at it, then back at Michael, and in a whisper barely audible, she spoke for the first time in 2 decades. She didn't want to go. The room fell silent. The therapist covered her mouth in shock. Michael nodded, sobbing quietly. She remembered. She had carried that night with her for 30 years. Not just in her silence, but in the pictures, in the symbols, in the sorrow. Michael gently laid his hand on the table. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. "I'm here. I found you." Julia didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. She stared at his hand. Then slowly, she placed hers on top. That moment, fragile, unspeakable, cracked open a healing neither of them had dared believe possible. The facility allowed Michael to stay for several days, under close observation. Each morning, he sat with Julia, by the window where she drew. She didn't speak again right away, but her drawings changed. Less darkness, more color. The forest no longer had looming shadows. The little girls stopped running. They began sitting instead, looking up at the sky. One afternoon, she drew a man, tall, with dark hair, standing between the girls. When Michael pointed at the figure and asked, "Is that me?" she nodded once. The progress was delicate, but undeniable. The therapists, moved by the emotional breakthrough, began reviewing her entire file with renewed urgency. There were gaps, large ones. Her original intake form had been doctored. Her date of birth was wrong. There was no mention of a twin. But now, with Michael's documentation and the national coverage, the staff initiated the legal process to reopen her identity records. For the first time in decades, the possibility of restoring her name, her real name, became a reality. But not everyone welcomed the attention. Just as things began to move forward, Laura received a call from one of her contacts. Hensley's legal team had filed an emergency injunction to suppress certain documents from St. Aurelia's and block the medical review of Julia's identity. Their claim? Irreparable reputational damage caused by unproven associations. It was a thinly veiled threat. One last grasp to preserve the empire of lies that had hidden June for so long. Michael was furious, but not surprised. Hensley was playing his final card. But this time, he wasn't the only one with power. Public opinion was overwhelming. Support for Michael and June poured in from around the country. A petition to preserve June's rights as a survivor gathered over 1 million signatures in days. Former staff from St. Aurelia's came forward, emboldened by the news story. Whistleblowers, witnesses, every one of them added a piece to the puzzle that now pointed squarely at the man in the shadows. The court hearing to verify Julia's identity was set for 2 weeks later. A DNA test had already been ordered, and all signs pointed to one inevitable truth. The girl once lost in the woods, once silenced in a system built on fear, was finally being named. And when she stood in that courtroom, even in silence, she would no longer be alone. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and clear. Michael sat beside June in the waiting room, his hand lightly resting over hers. She wore a simple dress, pale blue, the same shade Lily used to wear on Sunday mornings, and held a small sketchpad in her lap. The courtroom was already packed with journalists, advocates, and representatives from child welfare organizations. At the front sat Judge Morrison, an older man known for his fairness and sharp sense of justice. He had read the file. He had seen the evidence. But now, he wanted to see the girl. When June entered the room, a hush fell over the crowd. She didn't speak, but her presence was overwhelming. She carried years of silence in her posture, but also strength. Her eyes didn't look down. She scanned the room, as if searching for ghosts. And then, without prompting, she walked to the table in front and placed a drawing face up for the judge to see. 2 little girls under a moon, holding hands. One was colored. The other, outlined only in pencil. "This is what I remember," she whispered. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. It was only her second spoken sentence in over 2 decades. The judge took a long pause before speaking. "Miss Clements, or should I say, June Carter, this court recognizes the overwhelming evidence, including your DNA test, which conclusively identifies you as the surviving twin of the Carter family. Effective immediately, your legal name and identity will be restored, and any further attempts to suppress or obscure these findings will be considered obstruction of justice." Michael exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters surged. But inside that courtroom, June simply turned to Michael, reached out her hand, and said softly, "Can we go home now?" And in that moment, the story wasn't just about loss anymore. It was about return, about resilience, about a voice once buried in silence, finally echoing through the world and being heard. Home was no longer the house they had grown up in, nor the campgrounds that once held laughter before turning to silence. Home was now wherever June felt safe. Michael made arrangements for a private residence near the ocean, quiet and peaceful, where June could begin healing without the weight of cameras or courtrooms. There, she spent her mornings watching the tide and her evenings sketching in the soft glow of twilight. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was measured, intentional, and always about Lily. "She held my hand," she said one night, while drawing 2 girls beneath a canopy of stars. "She told me to run and not look back." Michael listened, his chest tightening. Each word she offered was another piece of the nightmare that had once been locked inside her. It became clear that June had witnessed more than anyone could imagine, and carried it alone for all these years. But now, she wasn't alone, and she didn't have to be brave in silence anymore. Laura visited often, keeping them updated on the slow but steady legal unraveling of Hensley's empire. More witnesses had come forward. The financial ties were undeniable. Prosecutors were preparing a full case against him, no longer just for obstruction, but for conspiracy, trafficking, and multiple counts of child endangerment. Still, Hensley remained behind a wall of expensive lawyers, waiting for something to break in his favor. But the truth no longer lived in shadows. Michael received letters from families across the country, some who had lost children, others who had been silenced as kids and never believed. June's story had become a spark. Survivors were speaking out. Laws were being reviewed. Foundations were being formed in her name. She had become a symbol, not because she asked to be, but because her survival was louder than the silence that had tried to erase her. And yet, through it all, Michael never let himself forget what had been lost. Lily, her laughter, her light, the way she always protected June. She was never coming back. But in every word June spoke, in every line she drew, Lily was there. Alive, remembered. And for Michael, that was sacred. The least he could do now was protect what remained, and rebuild a life not based on the pain of the past, but on the power of having found her. Months passed. June began weekly therapy, not with strangers, but with a trauma specialist who had worked with child survivors of captivity and dissociation. Progress was slow but steady. Some days she spoke more, shared memories, even smiled. Other days she simply sat in silence, looking at the ocean, letting the breeze carry away the weight of thoughts too heavy to speak. Michael never rushed her. Healing wasn't a race. It was a rite. One morning, while organizing some boxes, Michael found the old painting that had started it all, the one that had hung in the family home, behind which the note had been hidden. He brought it to June and set it on the table. She stared at it for a long time. Then she got up, took a charcoal pencil, and gently traced something new onto the canvas. A third figure, standing behind the two girls. Taller, strong, protecting them. "That's you," she whispered. "You found us." Michael felt tears welling, but he smiled. "I never stopped looking." Soon after, they held a private memorial service for Lily in a small grove near the ocean, surrounded by trees that reminded them of Camp Whispering Pines. But this place was different. Peaceful. Alive. June picked the spot herself. She planted a tree there, a tall white birch, and, at its base, she placed a flat stone with a single inscription. She didn't want to go, but she never let go. It was the first time June spoke in front of others, friends, therapists, a few supporters who had helped them. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "She saved me. She kept me alive. And now I will live for her." The sun broke through the clouds that day, and for the first time in 30 years, there was light. As spring unfolded along the coast, June slowly began stepping out of the shadows of her past. She began painting again, not just in sketchbooks, but on canvas. Her therapist encouraged it, and soon, the walls of the seaside house were filled with raw, powerful images. Two girls walking through fire, hands still clasped. A forest split between day and night. A girl standing alone under a storm, eyes turned upward. Every piece was a memory. Every brushstroke, a release. Michael noticed how the act of painting opened something in her. One day, she asked to visit the ruins of Camp Whispering Pines, not with fear, but with resolve. "I want to remember," she said, "on my terms." The trip was difficult. The air was heavy with ghosts. But June didn't flinch. She walked through the broken cabin doors, knelt by the place where their bunk beds used to be, and laid a single wildflower where Lily once slept. "You kept me brave," she whispered to the air, and in the silence, it felt like something finally settled. Meanwhile, the legal war against Hensley had reached a boiling point. With June's identity confirmed and her statements accepted into record, prosecutors filed an official indictment. Hensley was arrested at dawn. The footage aired nationwide. The once unshakable man led away in cuffs, his gaze hollow, his name forever tainted. Bail was denied. The charges now included child abduction, abuse of power, conspiracy, and unlawful concealment of a minor. He faced the possibility of life behind bars. June watched the news report with a blank expression. Then she turned to Michael and asked, "Will that bring Lily back?" He shook his head. "No, but it will make sure no one else has to live through what you did." She nodded slowly, understanding. Justice wasn't resurrection, but it was recognition, and that mattered. Later that week, she asked Michael if she could write something. Not for the press, not for a court, but for Lily. She spent days working on it, locked in quiet focus. And when she was done, she read it aloud to him. It was a letter, a goodbye, a promise. And in every line, every word, June was reclaiming not just her voice, but her future. In the months that followed, June continued to rebuild. She was officially recognized by the Carter family as the surviving twin, and the name, June Lily Carter, was restored to every legal document. The Carter family grave was updated, too, not just to include Lily's memory, but to honor June's survival. It read, "They walked together through darkness. One returned, so both could be seen." June began speaking to small groups of trauma survivors. Not often, not publicly, but with a quiet strength that came from truth. She told them about art, about memory, about silence that doesn't mean weakness. She never spoke about Hensley. He no longer deserved her story. Instead, she spoke about Lily, about love, about the fire you carry even when you're buried in the cold. Michael, now in his 60s, still wakes some nights from dreams of those first days. The note, the painting, the silent house filled with grief. But then he hears June walking in the hallway, humming to herself or sketching by moonlight, and he remembers. The story didn't end in 1987. It only began. Their house became a sanctuary for others like her. Children aging out of foster care, survivors of long-forgotten cases, girls who had been silenced and needed space to heal. June called it the Light Tree House, after the birch tree planted for Lily. It was quiet, gentle, powerful, just like her. And though June still had her shadows, she faced them now with open eyes. Some wounds never fully close. But when truth is spoken and love is stronger than silence, even the deepest scars become reminders not of pain, but of survival. And so, in the end, the girl who disappeared in the woods didn't vanish. She returned, and she lit the path for everyone still trying to find their way home. Years passed, but the story of June Carter remained etched in the conscience of a nation. Schools referenced her case in courses about justice reform and trauma recovery. Legislators introduced the Carter Act, a bill focused on increasing transparency in private child facilities and mandating lifetime tracking of minors removed from public records due to emergency transfers. The law passed with overwhelming support. June never attended the sessions in person, but Michael kept a framed copy of the bill with her initials inscribed at the top, JLC. In private, June continued her healing at her own pace. She took long walks near the cliffs by the ocean. She started journaling, quietly rewriting her story from the inside out. Sometimes, she and Michael would sit in silence for hours, watching the sun dip below the waves, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Lily was there, not in voice or form, but in every breeze, every drawing, every step June took toward wholeness. A National Museum of Child Protection invited June to contribute to a permanent exhibit. She declined to appear, but agreed to donate one painting, The Mirror. In it, two girls sat facing each other across a still lake, one in shadow, one in sunlight. It became the most viewed piece in the entire building. Visitors often found themselves crying before it, not entirely sure why. The plaque beneath the painting read, "She never left me. She walked beside me, even when no one else could see her." One spring, June and Michael received a letter from a woman in her 30s. She had been in the same facility as Julia Clements back in the 90s, and though she'd been too young to fully understand what happened, she remembered the girl who never spoke, who drew owls and stars and forests on the walls. "I thought she was magic," the letter said. "I think she still is. Please tell her thank you. For surviving. For reminding me to speak." June read it twice before placing it carefully in her journal, pressing a dried daisy between the pages. Michael's hair had gone white by the time he stood beside June at the dedication of the Light Tree Grove, a new public memorial garden, open to survivors of abuse and loss. It was her idea, not just for Lily, she said, but for the ones who don't come back, for the ones whose voices are still trapped. The garden was quiet, filled with birch and oak and wind chimes that rang with the breeze. At its center stood a sculpture of two girls holding hands, one looking forward, the other glancing back, as if guarding her sister's memory. The unveiling was small, private. No media, just survivors, advocates, and a few children who had been helped by the home June founded. One little girl, no more than 7, tugged at June's coat. "Is it true you found your sister in the trees?" she asked. June knelt, smiled, and nodded gently. "She found me first," she said. "I just had to learn how to listen." The moment was tender, sacred, and yet it reflected how far June had come, from a name on a missing poster to a living, breathing monument of quiet resilience. Her legacy was not her silence, but her choice to reclaim it, to use it not as a barrier, but as a bridge. Michael often thought about what life might have been if the girls had never gone to that camp, if the note had never been hidden, if the painting had remained undisturbed. But then he remembered something June once wrote in her journal. Sometimes we don't find answers. Sometimes we find new questions that make us more human. He couldn't undo the past, but he could honor it. Together, they built something that would outlive them both. And in doing so, they made sure the world would remember, not just the tragedy of what happened, but the beauty of what survived. With time, June's voice grew steadier, not louder, but clearer. She began working on a memoir, not as a literary performance, but as a quiet conversation with the girl she once was. The pages held more than facts. They held feelings, the terror of cold nights in strange places, the confusion of being treated like a file, and the slow, aching miracle of being found. She titled it When the Owls Stopped Crying. It wasn't about revenge. It was about return. The manuscript circulated quietly among publishers. There were immediate offers, but June hesitated. She didn't want her story commercialized. It's not for them, she told Michael. It's for her. For Lily. Eventually, a small independent publisher, one that worked closely with survivors, agreed to print it exactly as she wrote, without edits. It was released in limited copies, passed from hand to hand like a sacred object. Survivors wrote back. Therapists read passages aloud in sessions. And in a world so often deaf to pain, her words rang out like bells. One particular letter stood out. A man, now in his 60s, confessed he had once worked maintenance at Camp Whispering Pines. He had always suspected something was wrong, but had been too afraid to speak. After reading her memoir, he wrote, "You helped me face the silence I created. I don't know if I can be forgiven, but I will never be quiet again." June folded the letter, tucked it into her journal, and wrote beneath it, "Truth doesn't always punish. Sometimes it teaches." Michael, too, began speaking more openly about his journey, not as a savior, but as a brother who refused to stop looking. His words were filled with reverence, not pride. "She taught me," he said once in an interview, "she taught me that sometimes love is just staying when the world says it's time to give up." He credited Lily with giving him strength, and he credited June with giving him purpose. As the world moved faster and louder, June remained a quiet presence, painting, writing, healing others. Not everyone knew her name, but those who did carried it like a compass, because she was never just the girl who disappeared. She was the girl who came back with a map. The final chapter of June's public story was never broadcast. It happened beneath the surface, quietly, the way most miracles do. One autumn evening, as orange leaves fell against the window panes, June sat beside the birch tree she had planted for Lily. She placed a new drawing at its roots. It showed two grown women now, not children, one smiling softly, the other looking into the distance. In the background, a forest, golden with light. "We grew up," she whispered to the wind. "You stayed there. I came back, but I still carry you." It was the first year June didn't light a candle on the anniversary of their disappearance. Instead, she lit one on the day she was found. Her life continued in rhythms she created: garden days, painting mornings, evening letters to girls she would never meet but always understand. The Light Tree House became a national model for trauma-informed care. Survivors who had never been believed found a place to belong. And in the center of it all, June remained, not as a figure of tragedy, but as proof that even the darkest silence can end in light. Michael eventually retired and moved to a small guest house nearby. He often helped tend the garden or made tea while June wrote. Their bond had deepened beyond words, shaped by fire, loss, discovery, and a kind of love that asked nothing in return except presence. When he looked at her now, he no longer saw the little girl he lost. He saw the woman who came back and brought the world with her. And so, the story lived, not on front pages or in documentaries, but in whispered prayers, in letters passed between survivors, in drawings left at the foot of a tree that once stood alone. Because in the end, June didn't just survive. She became a lantern in the dark, for all the ones still waiting to be found. Years flowed like the tide June loved to watch, each wave gentler than the last. Her home by the sea remained untouched by time, quiet, serene, layered with memory. Visitors came less frequently now, not because they forgot, but because the work had spread far beyond her reach. What began as one story had inspired thousands, and the Light Tree Foundation had expanded into chapters across the country. June never took credit. "The roots grew from truth," she would say. "I just water them." Children who came through the foundation often asked to meet her. Most didn't know the full story, only fragments passed on from counselors or quiet teachers. To them, she wasn't the girl who vanished. She was the woman who listened. June had a way of making a child feel seen, without needing to speak. Sometimes she'd sit beside them, sketching quietly, and when they were ready, they'd draw too. Those silent conversations carried more healing than 100 therapies. One evening, while going through an old cedar chest, Michael found Lily's diary. He had stored it long ago, afraid to open it, but now, with June by his side, he did. The pages were filled with innocence, drawings of animals, stories about their bunkmates, complaints about mosquito bites and soggy shoes. And on the final page, written in red ink, was a sentence they had never seen. "If anything ever happens, tell June she can find the way. I'll leave the stars for her." Michael read it aloud, his voice breaking. June stared at the page for a long moment before gently pressing her palm against it. "She did," she whispered. "She left them in every drawing, every tree, every owl. I followed her the whole way." That night, June walked down to the beach alone. She laid in the sand, eyes open to the sky, and for the first time in her life, she didn't see darkness above her. She saw constellations stitched together not with science, but memory. And there, just above the horizon, 2 stars shone brighter than the rest, side by side, forever. When Michael passed, it was gentle, a quiet sleep, his hand resting on a notebook he had been writing in for June. She found it the next morning, wrapped in a blanket he had once used at the camp so many years ago. The notebook wasn't filled with facts or analysis. It was a series of letters, one for every year he had searched, one for every year he had hoped. In the final entry, he wrote, "I didn't find you. You found me. And in doing so, you saved us both." The funeral was private, just as Michael would have wanted. A handful of close friends, some staff from the foundation, and June. She didn't speak during the service. She didn't need to. She sat beneath the birch tree, her hand on the ground, eyes closed. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the leaves like a whisper. That night, she lit a lantern and placed it in the water, watching it drift into the sea until it became a single point of light on the horizon, a mirror of the stars. In the months that followed, June found herself more reflective. The past no longer haunted her. It sat beside her like a quiet friend. She published Michael's letters, titled "To the Girl in the Forest," with all profits supporting trauma survivors. She continued painting, but now her canvases were vast, skies, oceans, wide open meadows. Her brush moved with peace, not pain. One painting stood out from the rest. It was called "Return." It showed 2 girls walking through a gate of trees, one leading the other by the hand. But this time, they weren't surrounded by shadows. They were walking toward light, not blinding, but warm, soft, free. The final touch was a trail of stars behind them, fading into the trees. June hung it above her writing desk, not as a reminder of what was lost, but of everything that had been reclaimed. Not even silence could erase love. Not even time could sever truth. And sometimes, if the night was quiet and the wind just right, she would sit by the window, close her eyes, and whisper, "I found the way, Lily. I followed your stars home." As the years continued to unfold gently around her, June found herself becoming more a symbol than a person in the eyes of the world. People left notes at the base of the Light Tree statue. Letters addressed simply to June arrived at her door from all corners of the country. Some came from survivors who had endured unspeakable things. Others were written by children who had simply felt lost, unseen. Each letter was folded carefully and placed in a wooden box near a fireplace, a kind of archive not of pain, but of survival. She never stopped replying. Not to all. There were too many, but to those who seemed most fragile. Her words were simple, not poetic, not profound, just real. "I see you. You are not broken. Silence is not your prison. It's the beginning of your voice. One of her letters was read aloud at a university graduation ceremony for a class of students who had been orphaned or displaced. The entire room stood in silence when the final line was read. Being lost isn't the end of your story. It's the start of your courage. June rarely left her seaside home anymore. Not out of fear, but because she had everything she needed there. Her garden had grown lush, filled with climbing vines and flowers Lily once said were her favorite. The birch tree had grown tall, white and glowing in the moonlight like a sentry. Every year, on the anniversary of her return, June added a stone to the base of the tree, not as a symbol of mourning, but of gratitude, one for every life touched, every silence broken. And then, one evening, a young woman came to her door. She had eyes like firelight and carried a faded copy of When the Owls Stopped Crying. Her name was Talia. She had spent her early years in and out of foster care, had lived in a group home where no one believed her story, until she read June's. "You helped me speak," she said. "Now I want to help others." June invited her in without hesitation. That night, they sat by the fire, and Talia asked the question so many had asked before her. "How did you survive?" June looked at her and answered, "Because someone believed I was still out there." Talia stayed on. What began as a visit turned into a bond, one of mentorship, of kinship. She helped with the garden, transcribed June's old writings, and eventually began organizing the letters, turning the words June had written into a collection called The Lantern Letters. It was published the following spring and became an unexpected bestseller. Readers described the book as a gentle rescue. Survivors carried it in bags and coat pockets. One woman said it saved her from taking her own life. June watched all of this with quiet awe. Not pride, just reverence. She had never set out to be a voice for anyone. She had simply refused to disappear. But now, her refusal had lit a path that others walked by. And Talia, so fierce, so patient, became her echo. June would say, "She is what Lily might have been if she had been given the chance to grow." The two of them planted a second birch tree beside the first one. They called it the sister tree, a symbol, not just of what was lost, but of what continued. And slowly, visitors came to the grove, not to mourn, but to celebrate. Survivors left tokens, bracelets, drawings, pages from journals. A girl once thought to be forgotten had become the root of something vast, something quietly glorious. One evening, as a soft rain misted the earth and thunder rumbled far away, June gave Talia a sealed envelope. "When I'm gone," she said, "don't let them make me into a statue. No bronze, no plaque. Just plant something." Talia smiled. "A tree. A wildflower," June replied. "Something that doesn't need permission to grow." That night, Talia added her own sketch to the wall. Her and June, side by side, looking out over the ocean. Two generations of silence breakers. One past, one future, and somewhere beyond the edge of the waves, the stars shimmered in quiet affirmation. Years passed gently. June's hands became slower, her steps softer, but her spirit remained untamed, like the wildflower she had asked to be remembered by. She no longer painted every day, but when she did, it was with an elegance that only time and reflection could teach. Her last canvas was unlike the others. Not a forest, not two girls. It was a single flame in the dark, barely flickering, and yet impossibly bright. Beneath it, she scrawled a single word: still. That winter, as the sea winds howled outside, June wrote one final letter, this time addressed not to a stranger, but to herself. She tucked it between the pages of her first journal, the one she had written in silence, back when words lived only in her drawings. The letter read, "You made it, and though the world tried to forget you, you remembered. You remembered who you were. You remembered her. And in doing so, you reminded the world that love leaves trails, not footprints, but stars." It was signed simply J. She passed peacefully one morning, with the first blush of spring just beginning to thaw the cold earth. Talia found her seated by the window, sketchpad in her lap, pencil resting between her fingers. On the page, two birch trees bending toward one another, their branches intertwined in an invisible embrace. The world mourned, quietly, reverently. There were no headlines this time, only candlelight vigils, poems posted on fences, children tying strands of colored string to the branches of the sister tree. People gathered not to say goodbye, but to give thanks. June Carter hadn't just lived. She had endured. And in doing so, she became a mirror through which others found the courage to reflect and speak. Talia honored her final request. No statue, no grand stone. Instead, she planted a field of wildflowers along the cliffs, each one grown from seeds scattered across the letters June had once written. They bloomed in soft purples and golds, a sea of resilience swaying in the wind. On the anniversary of June's passing, survivors from across the country gathered at the Light Tree Grove. Some came quietly, alone. Others came with children, with friends, with lives they had once believed impossible. There were no speeches, just stories, whispered beneath leaves, passed between benches, drawn on sketch pads. Some brought candles. Others brought seeds. One little girl stood at the edge of the grove and whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." Talia spoke last, not from a podium, but sitting cross-legged in the grass, holding June's original sketchbook on her lap. She read from one of the pages that had never been published. A short note, dated years after June had returned. "I'm not what happened to me. I'm what I remembered in the dark. I'm what I chose to keep. And I kept love." A breeze swept through the grove, lifting petals and hair and breath. And in that moment, no one cried. They just closed their eyes and listened to the birds, to the trees, to the soft, unbreakable hush of a world that was learning how to heal. At the edge of the wildflower field, where earth meets sea, the birch trees stood tall. The branches had grown so close that their shadows overlapped, forming a single silhouette when the sun set. And above them, as always, two stars blinked just a little brighter than the rest. For the girl who disappeared, and for the one who came home. What began as a note hidden behind a painting unfolded into a decades-long journey through silence, memory, and unimaginable strength. The disappearance of two young girls shattered a family and echoed across time. But it was love that stitched the fragments back together. June Carter's return was never just a rescue from the past. It was a reclamation of voice, of dignity, and of truth. And in the quiet resilience of her story, we are reminded that even what's buried can rise, if someone dares to search long enough. Michael's unwavering hope, Lily's unseen sacrifice, and June's extraordinary survival form a tapestry that binds not only a family, but all of us who've ever wondered if the lost can truly be found. This was not a tale of tragedy alone, but of transformation. It wasn't just about what was taken, but what was never surrendered, the will to be seen, the right to be remembered, and the power of one soul refusing to vanish. June didn't speak loudly. She didn't demand justice with fists. She drew it. She lived it. And through every sketch, every letter, every step she took into the light, she reminded the world that healing is not about erasing pain. It's about honoring it. She showed us that survival is not weakness. It is a language, one that can move silently through decades and still arrive like thunder. And now, as her wildflowers bloom where once there was only grief, we must ask ourselves, how many voices are still hidden beneath the noise? How many truths are waiting for someone brave enough to listen? June's story may have ended, but her legacy has just begun, not written in ink, but in courage passed from hand to hand. If this story touched something inside you, if it made you remember, reflect, or simply feel, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this journey with someone who needs to know. There's always a way back, even from silence.